Okay, welcome everyone to the University of Victoria Department of Theatre's Orion Lecture Series. And today we have with us Dr. Rachel Han, who is a cultural scenographer from Northumbria University. And today Dr. Han is going to present a proposal for atmospherics as a process-based, non-binary approach to stage aesthetics and a model for future eco-decolonial scenographies. And I think this is really an important topic for us to be talking about. And when we think about decolonization and the environment and eco-scenographies, we, of course, are reminded that this all comes back to the land and the space that we are so privileged to do our work in here in Victoria. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples with whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. So with that, I'd like to again welcome Dr. Han to our public talk. I'm so privileged to have met Dr. Han in Taipei. I think was the first time we met at World Stage Design in 2017. I think it might have been in a pub. And I just thought, well, this is a really interesting person that I would like to talk to. And so from that point, we've been able to meet at various international conferences and events, from the Prague Quadrennial to, I think I was able to attend a symposium you were holding in London. And I've really come to appreciate Dr. Han's work for its ability to connect really difficult subject matter, theoretically difficult subject matter, with the current generation of students. I think that Dr. Han has this amazing ability to bridge this space between sort of emerging artists and really difficult, complex scenographic theory. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Han, and we will take questions at the end of the session through chat, and I'll filter the questions and then pass the questions on to Dr. Han for her to be able to answer. So Rachel, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. I'm honoured to be introduced in that way. I do wish that we could be going to a pub after this. I mean, unfortunately, not only am I in the UK still, but we are still in a national lockdown. So the thought of going to social occasions is incredibly exotic in this cultural scenario. So thank you for reminding me of that. I also wish that I could kind of have you in the room when I'm with my students, so that when I'm kind of talking about this theoretical stuff, they kind of recognise the way in which I'm doing it as much as the content in which being shared. So yeah, really honoured to be here and to be part of the Orion programme. Really exciting. I can see the speakers that are part of this series. It all seems really, really exciting, really timely, and really speaks very, very highly and very well of Victoria as an institution. So I'm an academic, so I've got slides to keep me organised. So I'll just share those now. I also put on eyebrows today, which I'm quite spectacularly happy about, because living in your own house, putting on things like makeup and all of that, it's a secondary concern. So I should feel honoured. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Yeah, I think you can. Make sure I can just see that.
Yes.
Okay, so I've got two screens, so I'm going to look this way and the camera's there, but it should be absolutely fine. So today, I want to talk about the idea of atmosphere. And what I mean by the idea of atmosphere is really something quite familiar to us as theatre and performance makers, but also potentially installation artists, potentially interior designers, the idea of gardening. All of these are cultivating a sense of place, cultivating a feeling of place. And it's that feeling of place which I want to ascribe to the notion of atmosphere. But as theatre makers, particularly in terms of the context of the Department of Theatre at Victoria, we're quite familiar of walking into a rehearsal room and thinking about the rehearsal processes that we're doing in terms of generating a good atmosphere, the right atmosphere for the show that we're looking to articulate. When we're in tech and when we're in rehearsals, when we're dress rehearsal, this idea of getting the atmosphere right, even if we don't say it in those terms, we feel it. Atmospheres are intuitive. And this is the thing that makes them challenging as a theoretical position. They kind of resist conventional forms of categorization. So for today, I want to meet that challenge head on. How can we celebrate the feelings of atmospheres as being intuitive? And how can we use that to kind of rethink what might be the political task of scenography? Now, I'm aware there's a couple of words there that I'm going to need to unpack, and that's the nature of this presentation. But certainly this idea of designing feeling in an era of climate crisis, as we go through, you'll see that all of my examples speak to this intersection of place, of land, and ultimately of ecology. How can we thrive with non-human species? How can we create performances that celebrate codependent species relationship? How might we articulate the feelings of a decolonial scenography? So as I say, I've got my little slides to keep me on track. And if you want to tweet me, at Rachel Han. I don't know if people still tweet anymore. I think it's probably TikTok now or something else that I've never heard of. But managing my social media is one thing. So Twitter is really good enough for me. So here are my questions that I'm going to use to punctuate the key sections of this presentation. The first being, is scenography a speculative device for investigating non-binary thinking? I'm going to unpack what I mean by speculative device and non-binary thinking in the first section. The second section is, if scenographics are approximately equal to atmospherics, what is the political task of scenography? And then lastly, does scenographics offer a methodology for practicing world differently? So when you see that last question, you know you're at the end. I mean, that's a good kind of, and I always promise a manifesto. There's a manifesto at the end. So once that's there, you know that you've kind of reached the time limit in that regard. So my first provocation, and this really features in my next book that I'm writing at the moment, which focuses on the idea of world in its multiple forms, cultural worlds, material worlds, and scenographic worlds. Donna Haraway, who's an ecological feminist theorist, posits this multiple use of the word world. So it matters what worlds, worlds. What I'm interested here is that second world is a verb. World as a doing. And as theatre makers, as scenographers, if our task is not in some way about the doing of worlds, about the articulation of world feelings, or indeed the enactment of little snippets of world, which we call a design, we call a scenography, we call a set design, we call a scenic design, whatever word that we choose to describe it. In some way, shape, or form, these are engaging with or rubbing up with ideas of world, tactics of worlding. Worlding isn't a phrase that I'm going to dwell on too much today. If you're interested in learning more, it's, I think, the kind of 7th chapter in my book, Beyond Scenography. It's called Scenographic Worlding, and it articulates a bit more about what I mean by that. But certainly Donna Haraway's usage of that second world, it matters what worlds. So in my book, Beyond Scenography, one of the legacy questions that came out of that was, what does scenography do? So rather than asking, what is scenography, changing the question to, what does it do? What does scenography do? How does it affect, orientate, and shape staged atmospheres? Now, I just want to elaborate what I mean by scenography. Coming from that ancient Greek, often the skene as a temporary hut or tent is described as, we have the word scene in English and in multiple other continental European languages to imply a compartmentalization of experience, a focused place, a attentive scene. Graphos, however, is often articulated in terms of a writing. And this isn't grammatically incorrect in that regards. But graphos within Greek is also about the act of scribing, the act of mark making. So not so much the logocentric, there's a word, the kind of message and interpretation system that we might ascribe to writing as a structural form of communication, words on a page. Graphos involves the act of scribing, the act of making marks, rather than necessarily the marks that are made. So this idea of a temporary structure, whether it was a kind of a tent or a hut, I like to use the idea of tent. This idea of scenography, of skenographos, might be seen as a kind of a scribing with tents. What would it mean to scribe with tents? But it might not be tents that are necessarily made just of material. It might be scribing tents of light, scribing tents of sound, scribing tents of feeling. I subscribe to the idea of scenography as about a coming together of the methods of costume design, lighting design, set design, and sound design. I'm interested in how these things come together to enact a feeling of place, a feeling potentially of world. So this idea of scribing tents of feeling leads me to these other sorts of questions of, well, if we're going to ask, what does scenography do? We might also ask, well, what does a stage do? What does a scene do? Within Beyond Scenography, I dwell on this question to then start asking the question, well, which comes first? A stage or a scene? Our stage is there first and then scenography emerges. But then we might think of the scenography of a performance in a clearing or a performance in a town square. We might still account for the place of the town square as being part of that scenography. It might be the kind of drawing just with a kind of bit of chalk on the floor. Which is the scenography? Is it the act of scribing the chalk? That creates and manifests the stage. So one of the arguments which I make within Beyond Scenography is that there are no stages without scenographics, that stage and scene are symbiotic, both critically, materially, and creatively, that when we create stages, we are creating them through scenography, that wherever there are stages, there is scenography. And this is a brief summary of this theoretical framework, particularly in terms of the distinction between scenography and scenographics, the intersection being ideas of place, stage, scene, I posit as a hybrid terminology, just so that I don't use the word stage or scene in the same sentence. It kind of indicates a clear distinction. Ideas of orientation, I adopt a cultural theorist called queer phenomenology in the work of Sara Ahmed, and her articulation of orientation and the dual meaning of it, both in terms of being near and far. We might describe orienteering as an activity of discovering our landscapes and finding our way through landscape. But orientation can also talk about sexual orientation, gender orientations. These cultural forms of orientation are equally about finding our way, about navigating ourselves. But as Ahmed articulates, that these dual meanings of orientation actually coexist with the ways in which we feel welcome, we feel foreign, we feel at home. All of these feelings of place are a combination of being near and far, the material relationships that we have to this place, but also the way in which these places have been politically inscribed with meaning, the ways in which we, both our bodies, our personalities, our identities, and the ways in which we identify fit in with that place, culturally and politically. So she gives the way in which she describes this is standing at an airport, and because she is of brown skin, she is looked at in a more intent way than if she was with white skin. And that this is a kind of form of orientation that she feels that place distinctly because of her race. And that is part of a feeling of orientation, which is both about proxemics, about being at a border and being at a cultural interchange, but also about the way in which certain bodies operate and feel within those places. Atmosphere, I'm obviously coming on to, and feeling I've already touched upon. So within the family of scenography, we might assign ideas of lighting design, set, sound, and costume, and the intersection of them. Scenography is the act of these tasks or methods coming together. Scenographics is potentially more expansive. One of the things that I argue is that while all scenography is scenographic, not all which is scenographic is scenography. This offers a political kind of distinction between ideas of scenography and the crafts of scenography and describing everything as scenography. This is a route that's described through expanded scenography. There's a wonderful book called Scenography Expanded by Scott Palmer and Jocelyn McKinney, if you're interested in finding out more about that. But my argument for scenographics effectively, first off, looks to resist a monolithic approach, so the scenographic perspective. By adding an S to the end of scenographic, I'm implying that it is a plural condition. It is a coming together of lots of different political systems, of feelings, of place, of materials, of crafts, but also that it's not necessarily wedded to a particular history of meaning. It's not necessarily connected to a particular history of practice. It's something which is materialized as a trait in lots of different types of staged material cultures, all the way from visual merchandising, so shop fronts, through to gardening, through to installation art, through to theatre and performance, through to architecture. All of these place-based cultures are potentially engaging with a scenographic frame. The words that I use to kind of articulate this are multiple. The ones that I'm going to focus on today are ideas of atmospherics. I've already mentioned worlding. Othering as an affirmative activity is an extension of Sara Ahmed's queer phenomenology, particularly in the ways in which we might think of, for instance, a queer, an LGBTQ plus parade within a town street, the way in which it reappropriates meaning to those spaces, but also embeds themselves within those spaces, that they become othering activities that call attention to particular political systems, but also become part of the cultural memory of that place. I really ascribe to Rebecca Schneider's argument of performance remains, that the things that we do echo through the places in which they occur through. I also have this idea of fast architecture and slow architecture. I've arbitrarily put them onto this map, if that makes sense. But all fast architecture is scenographic, and slow architecture, basically scenographics, call attention to what otherwise might be seen as permanent architecture. No architectures are permanent. Everything is always in process. It's just that from a human timescale, architecture may appear permanent, but instead it is merely slow. One of my key examples, I like to just articulate what I mean by this kind of place orientation of thinking about what scenographics might articulate in terms of a place-based philosophy of design, is Paul Sermon's 1993 telematic dreaming, and that in many instances, the Zoom-based cultures that we now exist through are an articulation of this. I love the fact that it's using a bed. It's such a simple and complex device all at the same time, but yet innately familiar. What you have is a projector kind of set up above it. And then in another room, there's a camera set up above another bed. And there, as we see, another participant is engaging via, in this instance in 1993, via a screen, which, as you can see just to the side, the participant in this room also has access to. What I love about it is that there is a sense of togetherness. Whenever you've played with projection, you'll be familiar with this, that you can even have a sense of touch, that as another person puts their hand over and the projection goes over. There's a wonderful book called Kissing Architecture, published by Princeton. And it kind of articulates this same experience, whereby when you project onto buildings, you can still see the architecture behind, but yet it is touching, it's kissing. It is a temporal relationship. And I think telematic dreaming offers a sense of the internet as a kind of place orientation, where we are together but distant. Tele coming from the Greek, meaning distant. So a distant matics, television, distant vision, telephone, distant phonics. And this idea of being connected but separate, scenographics and scenography as a practice can intervene, can complicate, can reveal, can irritate these feelings of world that maybe otherwise go unnoticed. So one of the questions I tended to get asked when writing Beyond Scenography was, what is Beyond Scenography? As I've already outlined, my articulation of scenographics is where I landed. The idea of world certainly is a center point for that conversation. I've put up some words that feature within the book, some of which are more prominent than others. Certainly ideas of othering and effect and prosmetics are there. Materiality, relations and texture also feature, but not as predominantly. There are lots of other words that we might have put around that symbol for world. But for me, it's really about thinking about the intersection. Scenographics are always at the intersection. It is never one thing, it is always multiple things. And this is what brings me to atmosphere. So for me, atmosphere is wonderful because it is so familiar. In an arbitrary way, in January 2020, I went and looked at, there's a particular journal that publishes all of the reviews from London and actually many different cities within that time period. And I went, okay, I'm just going to search for the word atmosphere or atmospheric. And there were 4 that kind of leaped up. There are actually slightly more, but these were the ones that I wanted to kind of dwell upon, just in terms of identifying familiar usage of the term atmosphere or atmospheric to kind of describe and critique and assess performance practice. These are by journalists working for national newspapers. And we see here this idea of an atmospheric staging, cozy atmosphere. Atmosphere is bleak and confrontational, soaked in atmosphere. Now, what I like about that last one, soaked in atmosphere, we don't need to describe it. We don't need to articulate what they mean by that, but they don't give any further description for it. It is intuitive. We have been in experiences which we would associate as being soaked in atmosphere. But from a critical theoretical point of view, it throws up a number of challenges. And in that respect, ideas of atmosphere have kind of been ignored by theatre performance theory, and to a certain extent, kind of broader fields of geography have led the way in the last 15 to 10 years. So I lean heavily on cultural geography to help understand what we might mean by soaked in atmosphere. How might we start that conversation? So a German art theorist who I pronounce as Boehm, but I've not got my umlauts probably quite right. He's been writing since the 1990s about contemporary art as being effectively an act of atmosphere, that all contemporary art is engaging in cultivating or producing atmospheres, whether it's a painting, whether it's a sculpture, whether it's installation art, whether it's theatre or performance. All of these things are about cultivating a feeling of a special occasion, of something which is happening, something which is occurring. And even when we're with a painting, it's the kind of being with a painting that's kind of special. There's something kind of really intrinsic to it that makes it an artwork. And Boehm argues this case in terms of that's a kind of a feeling of atmosphere, and that we might think of ways in which we might critique artwork as about thinking about the atmospheres that it cultivates, it brings together, and that it produces. But one of his central arguments is that atmospheres are indeterminate, above all as regards their ontological status. Now, there's a couple of kind of theoretical concepts there. I'm going to unpack them slightly, but I'm not going to dwell upon them. So we can always ask more in the questions. But it kind of becomes familiar when we start thinking about what is our model of theatrical reality. So the model that I'm presenting here is particularly central to a philosopher called Stanley Cavell, who wrote about ideas of theatrical reality. There's a wonderful book by Julianne Rabentish, which breaks this down, called The Art of Installation Art, I think it's called. I've got it on my, so it doesn't matter. But it's this idea of a Eurocentric model. I describe it as Eurocentric because it's predicated on what later I'll unpack as a global north perspective on philosophy, knowledge, and information. Particularly this idea of division. So very simply, subject and object, the subjective and the objective, these are things that we've all come across. In terms of assessing our own work, we might think, well, is this objective? How can we ramp up the subjectivity in this project? How can we think about the ways in which people are going to feel within this context? We might describe this in terms of its subjectivity, and we might describe our arguments as either being objective or subjective. This is a model of philosophy that divides one type of experience from another type of experience in order to define a particular understanding of reality. And theatre does this same thing. We might see this idea, the division between stage and audience. We might also see the division between nature and human. Contemporary ecological thought is all about, particularly with regards to the division between human and nature, that humans are part of nature, that humans are natural in their context and in the ways in which we thrive, and that the philosophical and aesthetic principles that have allowed humans to consider themselves as not natural, outside of even nature, that humans appreciate nature, but they are not themselves natural. They are not part of nature as a project and as a definition. That this division has potentially led us to cultures which allow ourselves to look at nature as resource and as unlimited resource, that it is for human consumption, for human desire. The ways in which the conservationist movement of the 1800s essentially kind of promoted this idea of conservation, of natural conservation, was effectively always predicated on ensuring that it was keeping humans out of it. And that it was the natural side which was kind of the wonderment, and that humans were kind of separate from that context. So these kind of ideas of aesthetics, of this division between human and nature, stage and audience, subject and object, materialize in a whole range of different types of aesthetic thinking. What, for the purposes of this argument, I'm describing as binary thinking. So this might be the divisions between machine and human, Western and other, stage and audience, subject, object, character and actor. Character and actor is actually the particular line that Cavell focuses on, that characters are always separate from the actors that are articulating, and that actually the dramatic texts exists in a different context to the acts of doing drama, the acts of making theatrical reality. We also see nature and artifice, and of course male and female, as other forms of binary thinking. That these divisions are based on a kind of categorical way of thinking about the world, or to use Haraway's idea, to think of world as verb starts to change this understanding. So if we think of binary thinking as categorical, effectively the world is a load of Lego bricks, and you kind of put it all together, and basically you can always just take out one of the Lego bricks and it's all still going to be fine. So we could take out humans from our ecology, from even planet Earth. We can go and emigrate, we can kind of colonize the rest of the galaxy. We don't need nature, we don't need planet Earth. We're better than it. We're kind of the product, we're the child of planet Earth. We can go do what we want. We are so egocentric, quite literally within our culture, that we believe that we can exist beyond nature. We can exist beyond the planet that has born us. This is kind of predicated slightly on the imagination of binary thinking, and particularly of categorical thinking, based on categories of things rather than on processual thinking, which again, for the nature of this presentation and this argument, I'll define as non-binary thinking. My best articulation of this is a soup. And I don't mean a soup just in terms of ideas of fluid thinking. These are established metaphors for thinking through kind of anything that's not categorical. But I use the kind of category of a soup mainly in the ways in which, if I was thinking of soup as building blocks, when I add my Tabasco sauce, I then taste my soup. I can definitely taste the Tabasco sauce. This kind of fits my world view as categorical in that model. However, the problem becomes in that I cannot remove the Tabasco sauce, not without an advanced chemistry set of some form. So that the idea that I can still taste the flavor of the Tabasco sauce with all of the other ingredients that are within the soup, but that the soup itself is generating itself. It's something which is it's independent of all of the material things, that it is currently going through a process of being this special thing I call soup. And that even though the Tabasco sauce, I can still taste it, I cannot culturally remove it. That it is part of this process now called my soup. And I will now eat it, I will digest it, and it will go into another kind of process called being energy for my body. And it had been other things beforehand. It had been the vegetables, it had been the soil, it had been the sunlight. All of these processes, the deep times and the deep past and the deep future of the objects that we exist with. Processual thinking is basically arguing that everything is always in process, in a state of transformation. And the understanding the intersectional nature of these processes is maybe a more useful conversation than trying to compartmentalize reality. So that's kind of a summary of where a lot of these processes of, or thinking of atmosphere as a process come from. And one particular cultural geographer called Ben Anderson has been writing about what he describes as affective atmospheres for the last 10, 15 years. And one of the particular arguments that he makes is similar to Boelm. Affective atmospheres are indeterminate with regards to the distinction between the subjective and the objective. They are neither wholly subjective nor wholly objective. They are both. And that's what makes them intuitive, that they are highly material, we can measure them, but they are also about emotion. We feel them. They are both at the same time. They mix together narrative and signifying elements and non-narrative and a-signifying elements. They are impersonal in that they belong to a collective situation and yet can be felt as intensely personal. On this account, atmospheres are spatially discharged affective qualities that are autonomous from the bodies from which they emerge, enable, and perish with. Crucially, atmospheres come and go, but yet they are also, they're everywhere. We're always with atmosphere in lots of different ways. And of course, from a geography point of view, you might think about the meteorological atmosphere, and certainly they include this within that. Ben Anderson is particularly interested in political atmospheres, the feeling of a nation, the feeling of a community, and how that is a kind of atmosphere. It's an atmosphere that feels highly material, highly real, but is yet also highly subjective. Derek McCormack, another cultural geographer working at Oxford, he's written a book called Atmospheric Things. It's a wonderful book, mainly because it's all about balloons. It's a whole book on balloons, but it basically uses balloons in a very precise way. And he basically argues that the balloon figures here as a speculative device for doing atmospheric things. By atmospheric things, I mean objects, processes, or events that in some way disclose, generate, or intensify the condition of being enveloped by the elemental force of atmospheres. So I really want to pick up this idea of speculative device to go, okay, well, if balloons can be speculative devices for exploring atmosphere, how might scenography be a speculative device for exploring and producing feelings of atmosphere, so that we might celebrate the indeterminate ontology of it both being highly about physical things, but also about emotion, cultivating things that appear to kind of, we put them in, unfortunately, we might put them in a lot of skips, but also about kind of storing them in cupboards and storing them away in places that they seem to persist, but yet performance itself is something which is highly temporal. It comes and it goes, just like an atmosphere. So this question, is scenography a speculative device for investigating binary thinking? First and foremost, I just want to state that this line of thinking, particularly in terms of describing these approaches, so atmospherics, assemblage is also another word that I use. Worlding, to a certain extent, could also be described as non-binary. Is highly indebted to a talk which Mick McKay, who's a non-binary identified performance designer based in Australia, they gave a presentation at the Prague Quadrennial on a panel, which I just so happened to be on, and they spoke just before me. And they afterwards, we realized that effectively we were talking about the same thing. It's just that Mick was describing it through the context of non-binary, and some of those binary divisions between stage and auditorium, those were some of the frameworks in which Mick was proposing their own scenography, the ways in which they might investigate distinctions between the public and the personal, between ideas of gender dysphoria and normativity. And I was like, wow, like I'm sitting here talking about assemblage thinking, and actually assemblage thinking is similar in so much that it resists the idea of not assemblage. So I'll go back to atmospheres. I use atmospheres as my main example. I challenge people to come up or argue the case for what is a not atmosphere or a non-atmosphere. It resists that kind of thinking. So particularly with the histories of post-structuralism, sight is a really good example. Marc Augé's argument on non-sight. So the idea of sight becomes defined by this kind of imaginary context of non-sight, which he then ascribes to ideas of railway stations and airports as being non-sight because they are transition spaces rather than destination spaces. However, when thinking about atmosphere, there is no non-atmosphere. It resists that because atmospheres are always either here or going. They're kind of coming and they're kind of moving between. They're always in a state of process. I like to give the example of being at a club night and all of a sudden the house lights coming on. That is a distinct shift in atmosphere. We feel that, we know that intuitively. Even before you're told, okay, drink up and kind of go home now, you know that it's not only a social cue and a codified cue, it feels differently to when the music's on, people are dancing, the house lights come up, it's a different kind of atmosphere. It's intuitively encouraging you to think, to behave, to act in certain ways. What Mick McKay's presentation offered for me was the thinking of, well, actually, let's celebrate that kind of feeling of atmosphere as potentially a non-binary concept, to really also start thinking about how gender more broadly can be articulated as a non-binary concept. One of the big struggles with ideas of non-binary was always, well, what else is non-binary? Because we're always categorizing things against other things. We're always imagining the antithesis of what something is, rather than thinking about the feelings that it generates and the ways in which it does that. So one of the artists that I've written about recently is Victoria Sin, who is a non-binary drag artist who uses their birth name. And they've been, actually, I think they're from Vancouver as well originally, although they've been based in, I think, London and other places for the last few years. I've got a timer on it for some reason. Their work is really fascinating in so much that it looks at the constructions of drag, but in particular, looks at drag as a kind of speculative practice. As we see here, I think about drag as an embodied speculative fiction, as a space for fantasy, where you can use this medium, which is very playful, to talk about things that can be really serious in an interesting and enticing way. What's fascinating about Sin's work is that they sort of approach drag as a kind of technology, as a way of expressing things that are beyond those technological devices. So we might see drag in these instances as a kind of speculative device, but also something which is highly predicated on the atmospheres that it encourages, that it cultivates. It's very material, it's very symbolic, but it's also highly about feeling. Whether it's the kind of overtly Hollywood references in terms of the makeup and the wig, whether it's the kind of clearly exposed breastplates and the breast forms, showing the constructions of drag and gender within those contexts. The image to the left is a performance called Sandwich, whereby one of the central aspects of Sin's character, particularly when in drag, is that they're highly they're kind of nonplussed. They don't really want to be there, but also they don't try not to be there. And one of the things they do is make a sandwich. And it's incredibly boring and incredibly dull, but that's the whole purpose of thinking about structures of femininity and, of course, of domestic activities and the assumptions around these things. So it's really, really fascinating. And they also think through the ways in which they deconstruct the kind of makeup contexts. Indeed, they originally started exploring drag as part of their fine art MA at the Royal College of Art in London. And the thing that they did, and this is actually one of their pieces that I have, was using makeup wipes and using that to kind of rub off makeup and then exhibiting the makeup wipes. And they would have lots and lots of these makeup wipes as part of their gallery exploration. And they realized over time that actually this was a character that they were painting on, and that they wanted to explore this as a performance-based activity. So the kind of character of the drag emerged from the makeup in the first instance. What I'm interested here is that it's looking at concepts of gender non-binary, certainly, but it's also looking at gender as an activity. We might articulate it as gendering, as a particular activity that we engage in, or we might look at gender as a verb, as a doing. I mean, the same way that we might think of world as a verb, if we start thinking of gender as a verb, we start kind of seeing that it moves beyond those binary contexts that have maybe been associated with it. Sin's quite clear about this. They argue that naming is an act of mastery, and I would hope to never do that to you. This is a particular, within one of their video works, they use that line again and again and again. They also argue how that if you're going to be truly queer or truly feminist or truly post-colonial, the English language is steeped in the creation and its use, so steeped in transphobia, patriarchy, and histories of colonialism. And then lastly, and I love this bit, they kind of encourage us to design, and I use the word design, they don't use the word design, but design for the emotions that we don't have names for. So rather than thinking about, okay, let's kind of make this a emotion, like let's not think about the names of these emotions, but let's try and design for feelings that exceed category of emotion. So it's no longer about happy or sad, about anxiety or about failure, about any of the kind of sorts of emotions that we might describe. And that intuitively starts moving us beyond the sort of tasks that we've associated with designing feeling. And obviously speak about my identity without naming it. So the next kind of example I want to give, this one focuses more on the non-binary context of place and how we might start rethinking our context of describing the world and think of world as a kind of verb. How might we as scenographers materialize that? So as an example of that, I've just got a video that I want to show you. This is from the opening sequence of episode 8 of Amazon Prime's series Doom Patrol. And this is introducing the character of Danny the Street. So I'll just play this video.
Agent Wilson, the second we get your signal, we're coming in hot.
You got your ticket to the freak show?
Yeah. Good to go.
Don't catch anything. You got this, Morris.
Let's tear it up.
He's new.
Who's the new hottie?
How bad is it, Agent? Abnormal to a factor of what?
Stand by.
Talk to me, Morris.
Agent Wilson, what's your 20?
So I'm just going to pause it there and go back to my PowerPoint. So the character of Danny the Street is from a DC series called Doom Patrol. What's fascinating about Danny the Street is that Danny is a sentient living being which inhabits streets, which also creates its own streets, but can also inhabit pre-existing places. It controls the temperature, the wind, the signs in the windows, and this is the way in which it communicates. One of the crucial things about Danny is that Danny cares for the people that live with Danny. Those characters that we saw walking about there, they're actually part of Danny. And there's a kind of an interesting thing about the way in which the characters are used in that regard. This is actually the original image from the comic strip. We see here that this idea that this is Danny, the trees, the buildings, the pavement, all inside the perceptual cabaret. So Danny likes to kind of build theatres within Danny, because Danny can then go explore anywhere in the world or imagine anywhere in the world through these cabaret kind of scenarios. So kind of Danny's a really fascinating character. Also, I need to cough. Danny is also one of the very rare DC characters which are identified as non-binary. So we saw there the kind of playing with gender stereotypes and things like that. Danny the Street is actually a kind of reference to Danny LaRue as a kind of a drag act from the 1980s. But this idea of kind of playing with assumptions on the difference between kind of human and place, between care and responsibility, between genders, these are all things that Danny encourages and experiments with. We see here this idea of where are you going, love? Well, I'm real glad to be going on to Danny Street. I like it here. And then Danny responds by saying, why, thank you, you're a charming child. What's really crucial about this is that I think, particularly in terms of the Doom Patrol series on Amazon Prime, it really articulates this kind of feeling of place, which is really exciting. But Danny also becomes and emigrates into different kinds of place, whether that's kind of Danny the island. Also, at one point, Danny is just a brick. And it's like that's all Danny is. Danny can be as small or as large as Danny wants to be. Danny also at one point kind of goes to another universe and becomes a whole planet. And some of the characters decide to emigrate to Danny the planet or Danny the world in order to escape the apocalyptic scenario that's being kind of played out within their own world. So this idea that Danny can be all the world and super small at the same time reminds us of that concept of the stage, that stages can be all the world and super kind of located all at the same time. Atmospheres might be thought of as being all the world and hyperlocated all at the same time. So Danny is a kind of non-binary concept of place that reminds us of some of the tactics of scenography that we might become associated with. McGibbon, who again is an ecological theorist, he's kind of taken a similar sort of route for thinking about how, from an ecological point of view, we need narratives that transgress feelings of place, which are about, feelings of place, which are based on prior philosophies or prior aesthetics of thinking, this categorical thinking. So he kind of offers this kind of starting point to his book, which is called Earth, although you'll see in a moment the way in which he pronounces that. So imagine we live on a planet, not our cozy, taken for granted Earth, but a planet, a real one, with melting poles and dying forests and a heaving, corrosive sea, raked by winds, strafed by storms, scorched by heat, an inhospitable place. It's hard. For tens of thousands of years that constitute human civilization, we've existed in the sweetest of sweet spots. McGibbon then argues that we're no longer in that planet. So that planet was our old planet, but we are now on a new planet. The Earth has changed in profound ways, ways that have already taken us out of the sweet spot, where humans so long thrived, where every day less the oasis and more the desert. The world hasn't ended, but the world as we know it has. It's a different place, a different planet, and it needs a new name, Earth, with the two A's. So McGibbon kind of argues that the ways in which we've named things in the past, we kind of need new concepts, new ways of naming place, particularly in terms of this planet that we live on. We need to call it something different to recognize that the practices and the ways of conducting civilization to date are no longer going to be not only sustainable, but possible in the long-term material lives of human civilization. So by calling it something else, whether it's Danny or whether it's Earth, this becomes a way of rethinking our relationship to narratives of place, but also about the creative license that we can play around with. Patrick, just quickly, how much longer do I have? I just realized I haven't looked at the clock for a while.
Not much longer, actually, about 7 minutes. So
okay,
including some question time, yeah.
In that case, I'm kind of towards the end in that regard. What I'm going to do is just skip forward to the manifesto that's at the end, because I want to ensure that we have time for questions, although very, very, very minimal. Yeah, I'm just going to skip through. So end with the manifesto. So I've got my YouTube series, if you're interested. End with the manifesto. I'm just going to let this play. There's a book, there's features in the book in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. What a lot to chew on, and I think some brilliant ideas about the way in which scenography can be a tool to reconsider our future and imagine different possibilities. So I'd like to ask our audience now for questions. Does anyone have questions for Dr. Han? Please go ahead and put them in the chat. And while we're waiting for people to bring up questions, I'll also mention to any of the University of Victoria Theatre Department students that are watching today, Dr. Han also has a drop-in session, office hours, if you'd like, and you've all been emailed with the information to be able to access those office hours. So I encourage you to please drop in and visit Dr. Han and talk to her one-on-one. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So why don't I begin with a question then? Where do you see this kind of approach that really looks at a way of breaking up binaries? How do you see that in terms of the culture of a department of theater? You know, how could you see this kind of tool that you've offered us that in a way we already use it to put on shows, right? So how could this tool be used to imagine pedagogy in a theater training program or in a liberal arts university setting?
Yeah, I think for me, the starting point is always that atmospheres are familiar. So when
Right.
we think about cultivating atmospheres, we're also thinking about cultivating shared states, how we're going to come together. And even though we might recognize that we're going to have different feelings within that atmosphere, different people are going to come with different expectations, different orientations, we can still kind of get a sense of togetherness. And I think it's that sense of togetherness that theatre does so brilliantly, and it does so wonderfully. And I think it's that provocation. How can we take that seriously? And then that idea of how does taking, if atmospherics and scenographics are kind of the same thing, then how might that change the political task of scenography? I think the idea of scenography as what I would describe as purely illustration or purely illustrative, that's one kind of way of thinking about it. But another way is that it kind of starts to rub up and it starts to reveal and irritate particular ways of thinking, particular ways of feeling world, that kind of affords it a real politics that maybe other
Right.
forms of practice have investigated. But I think scenography still operates in this real kind of tension between it both being fictive and real. And actually, it doesn't matter
Right.
whether it's fiction or real. When you go to a show, you feel it, and that's real. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's kind of a fiction or a reality. It's something that's intuitive.
Yes.
And how can we celebrate the intuitive nature of performance?
Yes. And we're all missing it so much, having not been able to come together in the
Yes.
same space for over a year now. So I see a few questions in the chat. So we have a question from Miriam Dumitra. And so the question is, how do you see the idea of gender as a verb fitting in with / working with addressing gendered experiences like misogyny or toxic masculinity that have less to do with how people perform gender and more about how traditional view on gender? Yeah, does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense, Miriam.
Yeah.
I think that's at the real tension between the ways in which, for instance, non-binary gender has essentially done a screw you to conventional traditional understandings of gender, but that screw you does not absolve it or absolve the structures of society which privilege individuals, which give power and permission to some over others, and that these kind of looking at gender as a verb in many respects becomes a playful creative metaphor through which to think about how we can free ourselves long term from those sort of structures, but they do not absolve us from the need to discuss, to debate, and to form policy on how we can confront these things in the short term. The ideas of non-binary, I mean, the argument is that everyone is non-binary because it absolves of the concept of gender as a power relationship. That's kind of the key thing. But it does not change society overnight. The societies that we exist in, we have inherited. I mean, in many respects, most of our societies, particularly in terms of the global north and the west, are, as a civilization project, about 400 years old. And that is an inheritance of particular forms of power, particular forms of decision making. Certainly in terms of global south thinking, there's lots of really positive ideas in terms of how gender outside of the global north projects was always seen as a kind of a verb, even though it might not be in terms of, there's ideas of dualisms. So rather than kind of describing particular individuals, there's still the idea of the masculine and the feminine, but then individuals might transgress or play with those structures rather than being categorical and assigned from day one. It might be more culturally produced rather than categorically produced. But no, Miriam, it's a great question. I can see there's more coming in.
Yeah, we've got. I'm just going to take one more question from Graham McMonagle. He's one of our PhD candidates and a fabulous costume designer and set designer. So he says slow architecture and monumentality. So fascinating in conversation with the idea of liminal monument, perhaps remembered environment / atmosphere, or familiarity of atmosphere. So he says he's sorry if it's not articulated, but is there something in there that that you can pull out, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think the provocation of slow architecture is really useful because it basically just allows us to describe the things that we see as permanent as just being another kind of process. And that atmosphere and environment are forms of process, are kind of quite literally, because we see them processing themselves every day. I can hear the wind basically beating up against my window this entire time. We are always with atmosphere in the same way that we are actually always with slow architectures as well. But then intervening with scenographic acts of fast architecture allow us to see the ways in which slow architecture are operating upon us or with us. That for me is what's really exciting. The ways in which, for instance, we go to a town square and we set up a Christmas tree, like that's a scenographic intervention. It's a form of fast architecture. It changes the feelings of that place. It introduces new atmospheres and it allows us to practice that sense of place differently. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Han, for this really fascinating talk. I know there's so much more. I can't wait for your next book to come out. What is your timeline for that? What are you hoping to?
Well, it all depends on everything else I have to do. That's always the problem. It's always lovely saying, "Oh yeah, I want to do these things," but I mean, it took me 5 years to do the last one. So
that's
I'm
pretty quick.
Take me 5 years to do this one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we look forward to it, and I would like to put an invitation out to anyone who's been watching live. Dr. Han is visiting my classes tomorrow, and if you're interested in joining us, I'm happy to open my class, both of my classes up. The first one is at 11:30 tomorrow morning Pacific time, and the other class is at 2 o'clock Pacific time. So please just send me an email to my email address at UVic, which is pduwars@uvic.ca, and I will send you the Zoom link to be able to join us. So again, thank you so much, Rachel. I'll encourage again all of the UVic students who would like to ask you more questions to drop in on the office hours this afternoon, and anyone else again who would like to speak to Dr. Han, you know, in or join my classes tomorrow, then please just send me an email and I'll set that up.
Yeah, I very much welcome that. You can also tweet me. You can tweet me, and I'll respond.
Yes, and also check out Dr. Han's YouTube videos. They're absolutely wonderful, informative, and entertaining, and atmospheric for sure. So without further ado, thank you everyone, and wish you all a great rest of your day.
Lovely seeing you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.